Right, so I have actual beliefs that run counter to the idea of God taking physical form as a human being, because I think that leads to a lot of weird side effects.
So Jews believe that God does not and cannot take human form. He does not incarnate that way.
Only he does. He does take on human form, not just in the New Testament, but right here he appears as a man to Abraham, and you can't brush that off as God just appearing as some kind of mirage to Abraham, because it's followed by him taking physical action in the universe, just like when he wrestles with Jacob, just like when he shows his back to Moses. Jesus is not an exception to the rule. God taking on human form, specifically in the Old Testament, is the rule. Hey everyone, I'm Stillman Smith Jr., and welcome to the Unapologetic Apologist, where we learn to be sophisticated and we're thinking about Christian philosophy. And today, we're going to be debunking some of the claims Ben Shapiro has made regarding Judaism versus Christianity. We'll be looking at some clips of Ben making his case against the New Testament and why he doesn't accept Jesus as the Messiah. Specifically, we'll be looking at two clips, one of him answering a question at one of his college lectures, and the other one of him speaking to Michael Shermer on his Sunday special. Which I think is awesome, by the way. Michael Shermer, of all people, pressing Ben on why he doesn't accept the Old Testament passages that supposedly predict Jesus as the Messiah. Now, Ben Shapiro has had discussions with multiple scholars and Christian apologists on this very topic. A few I'd like to highlight are, number one, his talk with Ravi Zacharias, just because I thought Ravi did such a great job at being very gracious towards Ben and focusing more on the common ground and bridging the gap between the two of them. Number two would be Ben's talk with William Lane Craig. Dr. Craig did such a tremendous job at really pushing Ben on how to explain the evidence for Jesus' resurrection from his point of view, which I think actually exposed a lot of holes in Ben's philosophy. The third is actually a segment from Dave Rubin's show where Jordan Peterson and Ben Shapiro actually debated Judaism versus Christianity. And funny enough, considering that Jordan Peterson is by no means a typical Christian apologist, I thought he did better than virtually everyone else in this very debate with Ben. I'll put links to all those videos in the description below, but in this video, I want to address Ben Shapiro's case directly. Three broad arguments that I've kind of highlighted out that Ben Shapiro makes. Number one would be the fact that Jesus as the Messiah is completely foreign to anything that exists inside Judaism. Number two, that God, in his view, not only does not, but cannot take human form in the world. And the third claim from Ben actually has quite a few historical components to it, mainly that the Jews always understood God to be absolutely one, that they always understood the Messiah to be a political figure and not a God man, not God incarnated in the world, and also that Jesus's kind of understanding and the early Christians' understanding of the Messiah, these are late Christian inventions, according to Ben, and that they're based on misreadings of the Hebrew in the Old Testament. That's Ben's case, and that's what I'll be addressing in this video. Real quick, if you're new to this channel, please subscribe, click the notification bell because subscriptions don't mean a whole lot, and sign up at subscribestar.com/TUA if you want to get early access to videos like this one, see exclusive interviews with apologists not found on YouTube, and support this ministry. Thank you guys, it means a whole lot to me. So let's get to Ben Shapiro, and I want to make a few things clear. Number one, that this is not by any means an attack on Ben. I've been following him for years, and I have nothing but respect for him. I agree with him completely on politics. I've learned so much from him over the years, and he's been one of the most influential people in helping shape the way that I think politically and philosophically. He's one of my biggest role models, and it really is a dream of mine to be able to meet with him and speak with him one day. Number two, that this isn't meant to divide anyone. Ben Shapiro has said on multiple occasions that the reason he rarely has this discussion is because he prefers focusing more on the common ground between Jews and Christians, and that there is a lot more that they have in common than what they have different. The common morality of Judaism and Christianity is what has given birth to the greatness of the West, and he even encourages people to go to church and be Christians for that reason. So again, this is not me going after Ben and saying you're completely wrong on this, and I think everyone should reject your beliefs and reject your religion and completely disregard Judaism. I encourage the union between Christians and Jews. That being said, I do think that these are important topics to discuss. Again, not that we should divide over them, but rather that this is an in-house debate. Number three, in no way am I claiming to be smarter than Ben or even as smart as Ben. His views on this are clearly well thought out, and I can only aspire to come close to his intellect. That being said, Ben Shapiro's catchphrase is, facts don't care about your feelings, and I do think that he's got some of the facts wrong regarding Judaism versus Christianity. So my hope is that the following video is just the spark of many conversations that I'll get to have with him in the future. So with all that out of the way, let's jump right in.
The Jewish version of the Messiah does not match up with the Christian version of the Messiah.
Jesus as the Messiah is a different figure than anything that exists inside Judaism. So when people say that Judaism predicts the coming of Christ, the change in the nature of what Christ is, what a Messiah would be, is different from Judaism to Christianity.
So let's start right here, because there actually is some truth to this. The Jewish expectations of the Messiah at the time of Jesus were in fact different than who Jesus claimed to be and what he accomplished. But we do need to make a very important distinction here, and I want you to keep this distinction in mind as we move forward and respond to Ben's other claims. The distinction is between what the Jewish priests and the people at the time expected the Messiah to be like, and what the Old Testament actually said the Messiah would be like. Because as we get into the Old Testament and some of the New, I think you will notice at least two reasons for the disconnect. The first has to do with the fact that some of the Old Testament descriptions of the Messiah regard Jesus' second coming. So when Ben talks about the Messiah doing things like restoring peace to Israel and a couple other things he mentions, we agree that these are things Jesus is going to do upon his second coming, but that's his second coming, not his first. The second reason for the disconnect is looking retrospectively at Jewish doctrine rather than looking at its development over time. As we'll see going forward, a lot of the differences between Judaism and Christianity are actually due to later revisions in Jewish theology as a response to early Christianity. So we'll actually come back to this later, but just keep that in mind as we move forward.
So Judaism never posited that there would be God come to earth in physical form, and then acting out in the world in that way. Judaism posits that God is beyond space and time. Occasionally he intervenes in history, but he doesn't take physical form. It's one of the key beliefs of Judaism, actually, is an incorporeal God. So that means that the idea is actually foreign to Judaism of a merged God-man who is God in physical form, but then dies and is resurrected and all this. It's just a different idea than exists in Judaism.
So there's a lot to tackle here, but let's start by separating two things that Ben mentions here. The first is that the idea of the Messiah in Judaism is not God taking on physical form. The second is an even bolder claim, and one that Ben actually says is one of the key core beliefs of Judaism, namely that God can't even in principle take on physical form. Now, to answer these, I want to actually turn to Nabeel Qureshi, one of my favorite Christian apologists of all time. It's actually a genuine sadness in my heart that I'll never get the opportunity to speak to him, at least in this life. That being said, the impact that he's had on my life and no doubt countless others is truly something incredible. Now, the clips I'm about to show you are from a debate that Nabeel had with Muslim scholar Shapiro Ali on whether God is absolutely one, Tawheed, or three persons in one divine essence, the doctrine of the Trinity. What's interesting is the path that Nabeel Qureshi chose to take in proving God to be triune, far from focusing on the New Testament, was actually to focus primarily on the Old Testament before merging into the New. So first we'll answer the claim that God can't even in principle take on physical form. And we'll separate that into two parts. The first being that he can't take physical form, and then the second one, more specifically, that he can't take on human form. The problem for Ben here is that this actually happens many, many times in the Old Testament, that God takes on several physical forms. Don't believe me? Hear it from Nabeel.
Can God come into the world? The answer is yes, many times over. Genesis 3:8, for example, they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day. So God comes and walks in the garden. Genesis 32:28 through 30. It says, you have striven with God and with men and have prevailed. And Jacob responds, verse 30, I have seen God face to face and my life has been preserved. So even he's shocked. I saw God and I'm still alive. Check that out. That's what Jacob says. He sees God. In Exodus 3, verse 4, when the Lord saw that he turned aside to look, God called to him from the midst of the bush and said, Moses, Moses, and he said, here I am. So God calls out from this burning bush. Interestingly, the rabbis said, I'm going to see if I can find this in my notes, but the rabbis have been noted to say that this was, Nachmanides said this in the 12th century. Let's see if I can find it. No, I can't find it. But anyway, Nachmanides, who's a Jewish rabbi, has said that that God can mitgeshem, he can incarnate. And when God was speaking out of the burning bush, that was indeed God. I hope to find that quote for you soon, but the Jews saw it that way too, that this is indeed God. Let's keep going a little bit further. Exodus 13:21. The Lord was going before them in a pillar of cloud, by day to lead them on the way, and in a pillar of fire to lead them by night, to give them light. Exodus 24, how much clearer can we get? They saw the God of Israel, and under his feet there appeared a pavement.
So that's the first part. God not only can, but does take on several physical forms. And included in those examples, by the way, are human forms. And that's just the first few books of the Old Testament. And a side note here is that it's quite difficult for Ben to claim that's one of the core beliefs of Judaism, that God can incarnate, when, as Nabeel points out, the early Jewish scholars said specifically that he could incarnate. But for Ben's more precise claim that God can't take on human form, I want to take a look at Nabeel's commentary on Genesis chapter 18. But I'm going to include Nabeel's lead up to that verse because as we cover some of the ground ahead, some of the verses we're going to look at could seem contradictory if we assume that God is only one in his person. Pay attention because this is going to be very important later on. So here's Nabeel starting with verses in the Old Testament that show God at the very least to be Binitarian, which is a theology of two persons in one divine substance, and then he'll lead into Genesis chapter 18 where God takes on human form.
The first time we see God introduced in the Old Testament is the very first verse of the Old Testament. The word God is Elohim. Okay, but notice, the word Elohim is plural. Technically, we translate this word gods. However, the verse treated that word as if it were singular. So it's plural and singular at the same time, from the very first verse of the Old Testament. There are actually 4 examples of this plural form God in Genesis chapter 1. I can't go into all, but one more that I want to go to is Genesis 1:26. Same chapter, 4 examples. This is the second. It's that God says, "Let us make man in our image." Now you might say, well, that's just majestic talk. God is just being majestic. Gleason Archer has pointed out that never in the Hebrew Bible does that way of using the word us ever get used in a form of majesty. God is saying something about himself. He's plural and yet singular. Now, the most common response to this, and the one I've heard Dr. Ali give the most in his talks, is what about the Shema? This is like the Jewish Shahada. This is Shema Yisrael, Adonai Eloheinu, Adonai Echad. Doesn't that say, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one"? Well, that's one translation of it. What it can also say is, "Hear, O Israel, Yahweh is our God, Yahweh alone." And in fact, that is one of the Hebrew translations used today, even among Jews. Now note, the word echad is an interesting word. Whenever the Bible wants to talk about something that is one and has multiple components in that one, it uses the word echad. Follow me, this is extremely important. If God wants to say, "I am one and plural," the word he would use is echad. How do we know that? Let's look at these examples. Genesis 1:5 is one example. Let's look at Genesis 2:24. It says, "Man and woman will become one." The word one there is echad. Man, woman, 2 people will become one echad. Numbers 13:23, a single cluster of grapes, many different grapes making one cluster, is echad. That's what the word echad means. Now, there is a perfectly good word for one and one alone in Hebrew, and that's yechid. For example, in Judges, she was his one and only child, yechid. Jeremiah, mourn as if for an only son, yechid. So if Yahweh wanted to say, "I am one in one alone," he would have used the word yachid. But if he wanted to say, "I am one in plural in my unity," he would use the word echad, and that's exactly what we see him as having used. So we're introduced to a God who can be potentially complex. He refers to himself in the plural. And then we start seeing this. This is fascinating. I want you to watch this very carefully. In Genesis chapter 18, it says that Yahweh appeared to Abraham at the oaks of Mamre near Sodom and Gomorrah. Yahweh appeared. So this is another one of those examples where God appears as a man. Then in verse 19:24, look at this. It says, now here's Yahweh about to rain fire on Sodom and Gomorrah. It says, Yahweh rained on Sodom and Gomorrah from Yahweh out of heaven. Think about this. Yahweh, who's appeared as a man, is raining fire from Yahweh in heaven. And the Hebrew here actually says Yahweh twice. This isn't a bad translation of the Hebrew. What does this mean? Well, we know the Jews only believe in one God. How can Yahweh be there and here? Now, is this just Nabeel's interpretation of the Old Testament? Is this just a weird thing I'm doing with the text? Look at Amos chapter 4, verse 11. I overthrew you as Elohim overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah, declares Yahweh. Even the Old Testament realizes that Yahweh declares that Yahweh overthrew Sodom and Gomorrah. There are two, but we know there's only one God.
Right, so I have actual beliefs that run counter to the idea of God taking physical form as a human being, because I think that leads to a lot of weird side effects.
So Jews believe that God does not and cannot take human form. He does not incarnate that way.
Only he does. He does take on human form, not just in the New Testament, but right here he appears as a man to Abraham, and you can't brush that off as God just appearing as some kind of mirage to Abraham, because it's followed by him taking physical action in the universe, just like when he wrestles with Jacob, just like when he shows his back to Moses. Jesus is not an exception to the rule. God taking on human form, specifically in the Old Testament, is the rule. But now let's go back to Ben's claims about the Jewish expectations of the Messiah being very different from who Christ was.
Jews also don't believe that the Messiah is a God figure. They don't believe that it's God descending to earth to die for the sins of other people. They believe that the Messiah is a political figure. Maimonides talks about certain things that the Messiah is going to have to do, including the rebuilding of the Third Temple, including the recreation of the Davidic monarchy. These are things that Jews believe the Messiah does, but nowhere in there is there a definition of Messiah as God figure. That's a Christian invention. It's not inherent in Jewish belief.
So there are two important claims from Ben here. Number one are the things that the Messiah is expected to accomplish. And number two is the fact that the Old Testament never portrays the Messiah as a God-man, so to speak. Now, as I mentioned earlier, and this is something I've talked about on the show before, a lot of the things that Ben claims there are things that we as Christians agree with him that the Messiah is going to accomplish. We just believe that those are things Jesus is going to accomplish upon his second coming. And so Ben looks at Jesus' first coming and says, oh, look, these things weren't accomplished, therefore Jesus wasn't the Messiah, and that's simply a category error. But I want to focus on something that I think is more fundamental here, and that's Ben's claim that nowhere in the Old Testament is the Messiah portrayed as a God-man. Here we'll continue with Nabeel Qureshi, and as he covers some of the Old Testament and then merges into the New, you'll see that is simply untrue.
Take a look at Psalm 110, verse 1. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand. In that context, sitting at the right hand of God is like ruling the universe with God. And it says, the Lord said to my Lord. Once again, we see that there's almost as if there are two gods, but we know there's only one God. The Old Testament is very clear about that. This is one that I definitely want you to grasp. Daniel chapter 7, verse 13. Daniel sees the Ancient of Days, who is the Father, God. He sees God, and then he says in verse 13, I kept looking in the night visions, and behold, with the clouds of heaven, one like a son of man was coming. And he came even to the Ancient of Days and was brought near before him. Okay, so here's the Ancient of Days, and there's one who looks like a son of man coming on the clouds of heaven. Deuteronomy 33 tells us only Yahweh comes on the clouds. But here's Son of Man coming on the clouds. So already we should be thinking, wait a minute, these are two God figures. And then verse 14 says this, and to him was given dominion, glory, and a kingdom, that all the peoples, nations, and men of every language might serve him. Wait a minute. To the Son of Man is given glory over heaven? That's what it says. And it says the people of every nation and language will serve him. This word serve is used over 130 times in the Bible. Every time it's used is used to denote a service due to God alone. And here it's being given to one who looks like a Son of Man. So it looks like once again we have God the Father and we have this other kind of divine being who's called one who looks like a Son of Man. Here's the point I want to make to you. The earliest Christian records proclaim that Yahweh came into this earth. It's something he has done before, and he's going to do it. We're promised he will do it in Isaiah 9:6. This is what Mark's gospel has to say about Jesus. Mark 1, verse 3. As it is written in Isaiah the prophet, prepare the way of the Lord, make straight paths for him. Now, Isaiah is saying Jesus is coming. Prepare the way of the Lord. Look in Isaiah 40, verse 3. Clear the way for Yahweh in the wilderness. Make smooth in the desert a highway for our God. Mark takes the word Yahweh and puts Jesus in that very same context. He's equating Jesus to Yahweh. Mark 2:28 says, the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath. Well, the Sabbath is one of the 10 commandments. When Jesus says he's Lord of the Sabbath, he's saying he's Lord of the 10 commandments. Once again, Mark is giving Jesus a prerogative of Yahweh alone. In Mark 4:38, the disciples were on a boat caught in a storm, and they called out to Jesus in their trouble, and he delivered them and made the storm to be still. Look at Psalm 107. God's people are on a boat caught in a storm, and they called out to Yahweh in their trouble, and he delivered them and made the storm to be still. Mark is taking Yahweh out and putting Jesus in. In Mark 14:62, when Jesus is asked who he is, he gives a trifold response. We're going to focus on the second part. He says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the power and coming with the clouds of heaven. What does this remind you of? The two verses from the Old Testament where it looked like there are two divine figures. The one sitting at the right hand of the power, co-ruler over the universe, and the one coming on the clouds of heaven, who comes only as God would come, is given only the divine prerogatives of God, and served worship by all people for all time. Jesus says, you remember those passages which had two Yahwehs? One of them is me. And this is why they said, crucify him, because he was claiming to be God. Look, this isn't just found in Mark's gospel. Here's the other point that I want to make to Dr. Shapiro Lee. Every single earliest record we have in the New Testament portrays Jesus as Yahweh. The Carmen Christi of Philippians 2 is one of the earliest records we have of Christian history. It's an insight into the time before the New Testament was written, right after Jesus was resurrected. What does it do? In verses 10 and 11, it says, to Jesus, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Where do they get that from? Isaiah 45, where it says, to Yahweh, every knee will bow and every tongue will confess. Even before Mark's gospel, people are taking Yahweh's name and putting it in with Jesus. In 1 Corinthians 8:6, we see Paul, and this is actually pre-Pauline, as Bart Ehrman would argue. He does argue in his new book. The earliest, even before Paul, even before Mark, Christians took the Shema Yisrael, Yahweh Eloheinu, Yahweh Echad, took that and divided that up between two, the Father and the Son. And that's what 1 Corinthians 8:6 is.
As we can clearly see, this is not a late Christian invention. This is the Old Testament where this is coming from. And that brings me to another claim from Ben.
Now, it's possible, I mean, I've read all the messianic arguments about where this is foreshadowed in the book of Isaiah and all that. Jews obviously interpret those passages differently.
So the argument typically made to Jews by Christians on this is that Jews it's forecast by the Bible.
Right.
And for Jews, we have a whole different read when you read the Hebrew about why this may or may not be true.
But Christians claim the Old Testament predicts it's going to come, so
right.
You disagree.
Well, I disagree because I think a lot of the verses that are cited are actually misreads of the Hebrews.
Now let me be clear here. I do not read Hebrew, so I am not claiming any authority on the matter. But Nabeel Qureshi has constantly been going back to the Hebrew. And that's why I've included quite a bit from the debate. Because I submit to you that the reason Ben Shapiro is coming to the conclusion that the Messiah described by the Old Testament is not a godlike figure, when it clearly seems that it is because Ben is starting with the presupposition that God is only one in person. And as I said earlier, the passages that Nabeel has been covering in this video can seem contradictory because they keep referring to two godlike figures. But if God is triune, or at the very least binitarian, then there's no contradiction. But if Ben is assuming when he comes to the text that God is only one in person, that he's singular in his unity, then he's forced to interpret the scriptures in light of that fact. And that brings me to my final point in this video. As we've seen, Ben is simply incorrect in claiming that the Messiah as a godlike figure is a late Christian invention. But what does that imply? The implication is that the Jewish description of the Messiah is a late invention. But how can that be if Judaism predates Christianity? This is where we tie all the pieces of this video together. As it turns out, the early Jews, including the Jews at the time of Jesus, actually believed God was binitarian. Again, meaning that God is one in his essence, so still a monotheistic God, but at least two in person. And as evidence for that, let's take a look at this exchange during the debate.
You refer to Daniel 7:13 and Mark's statement where Jesus seems to make the claim that he is that apparently divine figure. But you realize that in Daniel 7 rather, that this Son of Man that is spoken of there is not the Ancient of Days. This is the one who approaches the Ancient of Days. So you have here a divine figure, but not necessarily God. And in fact, not God, because God has to be the Ancient of Days. So aren't you doing the same equivocation thing where you're looking at my time up? Okay.
Dr. Qureshi.
I love talking about the Son of Man. This is my favorite thing. I want you guys to get this. I want everyone to understand this. It's not that when Jesus calls himself the Son of God, he's talking about being divine, and when he talks about the Son of Man, that's when he talks about being human. Wrong. It's actually this verse, Daniel 7:13. Yes, you do have the Ancient of Days sitting on his throne, and then you have one who has all the prerogatives of God, is described as coming in as God. He receives worship that only God can receive. And this is why we say that, okay, you have two different persons who are both God, found in Daniel 7:13 and 14. We have Jewish scholars today who say that Jews at the time of Jesus were binitarian. So even the Jews, according to a Jewish scholar, Daniel Boyarin, even the Jews saw this as two, yet one. That's why they were binitarian at the time of Jesus. Alan Siegel, in this book, says that Jews at that time were binitarian, and he says it's apt to call them binitarian if you look at page 150. They were binitarian because of verses like this, where you have two in one. It was their exegesis, not their philosophy, not some sort of evolution which led them to believe that God is plural in his nature.
So why? Why did that change? It changed because after the resurrection of Christ, the early Jews needed a way to refute the early Christians, saying that Jesus was both God and the Messiah. So they revised their theology to exclude both God being binitarian and capable of incarnating in the world.
It's because of verses like these that Jewish scholars, like Daniel Boyarin, have said Jews in general did entertain a logos, and so were implicitly binitarian in their theology. It is only the rabbis in response to Christianity who begin to make such opinions heretical.
So let's summarize. First, this is not an attack on Ben Shapiro. I am in complete agreement with Ben on the common ground and the common goals between Christians and Jews. But I do think these were very important points to address because a lot of people follow Ben. He has a lot of influence, and I do think that some of the history he cites on these matters isn't the most accurate. And so I do think this was an opportunity to discuss some important topics, as well as reach out my hand to Ben. Ben, you are welcome on my show at any time to discuss these topics or any topics. Really, I love your book, The Right Side of History. You've had such a positive impact on me, on my life, and I can't thank you enough for that. Second, go watch the videos for yourself in which Ben makes these claims. There'll be links to them in the description below. You can see them in their full context, as well as Ben's discussion with William Lane Craig. Watch the debate between Nabeel Qureshi and Shabir Ali and read the Bible passages in their full context and decide for yourself what you think is the best explanation for the biblical data. What I find most incredible about Ben's claims is that even if we were to throw out the New Testament completely, we would still have to struggle with an Old Testament that not only teaches God taking on physical and human form time and time again, but an Old Testament that teaches at the very least two, but I would argue even three persons in the Godhead. Isaiah chapter 48, verses 12 through 16. Listen to me, O Jacob and Israel, my called. I am he, I am the first, I am also the last. I was there, and now the Lord God and his Spirit have sent me. I am the first and the last. Okay, that's only God. And the Lord God and his Spirit have sent me. That's three. That's in the Old Testament. And lastly, three things to keep in mind when looking at the data. First, distinguish between Jesus' first coming and his second coming. Second, understand how the Jewish rabbis revised their theology in response to the early Christians. And third, and perhaps most important, is that how we understand God will have a huge impact on how we interpret the Old Testament. If God is absolutely one, as Jews claim, then we're going to interpret the Old Testament in such a way that would exclude the Messiah as being God incarnate. More than that, we would have to then reject the examples that seem clear of God incarnating in the world, and then, of course, reject Jesus as Messiah because he claims to be God. But if we understand God to be three in persons, if we understand the doctrine of the Trinity, or even if we just accept the doctrine of binitarianism, then there's no contradiction in these verses that present us with two God figures. And then, of course, we can make perfect sense of the New Testament passages that place Jesus as one of those God figures. All right, thank you guys. I really hope you've enjoyed this video. If you'd like to see more, please subscribe, turn on notifications. And if you would like to support this ministry, it would mean the world to me if you'd consider signing up at subscribestar.com/TUA. You get access to all the bonus content, early access to videos, web extended, and a lot more. As always, thank you guys so much, and I'll see you next time.